Thank you for joining us for our next installment of the Grace Grid video podcast. I hope today to continue in the series I've been working on so far, based on my small book that I finished not terribly long ago, Grace Grid. I actually have a new shipment in recently with a slightly nicer cover, so if you're interested in that, I'll put some links in the bottom in the description. Amazon now has Kindle edition and hard copy edition available for order if you like. So yeah, another look at it. There it is. Not terribly long. It's just basically a very small overview of the Christian faith, and so I've not been giving full overviews of every chapter in the video podcast. Really, I've been sort of trying to take a basic theme or nugget from each one just to give an idea of what it's about. And so this time around, I'll be talking about, as I mentioned last time, the nature of man. As I deal with this topic, I really only want to cover one tough theological question that many people eventually come to ask when they think of the gospel. Obviously, our problem is that in our nature, as we're born, as all denominations and Christians hold to, is that we are bent away from God. Because we're fallen, because of the fall of Adam, we have a nature that is ultimately hostile toward God. Romans 3 really gives the really darkest picture of that anywhere in Scripture really does. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. And the question that comes up really is, if our problem is that we're by nature opposed to the plans and the purposes of God, how can it be that we'll become a people who embrace the plan of God of salvation? Now, it may no longer be by works, it may be now by faith. We'll talk about that as we talk about the gospel. But even that, if our hearts are opposed to God, what is it that causes us to embrace the gospel, even if it's only by faith? What causes God to become beautiful to us? And really this comes down to the question of our moral ability versus our natural ability. These are interesting theological terms I'm throwing around. I want to start out really by reading two rather lengthy paragraphs by one of my favorite theologians, Jonathan Edwards. Now, not all of you will maybe be able to follow his train of thought, so I'll break it down afterwards, but I want to just let him sort of talk about this on his own, and we'll see how that goes. Really, the tough question that he's answering here is, really, Scripture lays out this picture of people that are morally incapable of loving God, and yet they're responsible to do so. So how can God hold someone responsible for not embracing Him if they're really ultimately not capable of doing it? And so what he does is he talks about two different kinds of ability that we can speak of. And often people will hear about this and just disagree right off the bat, but then what he shows is, actually, this isn't that unreasonable of a concept. We actually think this way every day. And so I'm going to read the two paragraphs and see what you think, and then I'll explain a little bit. So here it goes. This is a quote from Jonathan Edwards in his work, The Freedom of the Will. What has been said of natural and moral necessity speaking of what is bound to happen ultimately, moral necessity, may serve to explain what is intended by natural and moral inability. We are said to be naturally unable to do a thing when we cannot do it if we will, because what is most commonly called nature does not allow of it, or because of some impeding defect or obstacle that is extrinsic to the will, either in the faculty of understanding, constitution of body, or external objects. Moral inability consists not in any of these things, but either in the want of inclination, or the strength of a contrary inclination, or the want of sufficient motives in view to induce and excite the act of the will, or the strength of apparent motives to the contrary. Or both these may resolve into one. And it may be said in one word that moral inability consists in the opposition or want of inclination. For when a person is unable to will or choose such a thing through a defect of motives or prevalence of contrary motives, it is the same thing as his being unable through the want of an inclination, or the prevalence of a contrary inclination in such circumstances and under the influence of such views. A strong habit of virtue and great degree of holiness may cause a moral inability to love wickedness in general, and may render a man unable to take complacence in wicked persons or things, or to choose a wicked in preference to a virtuous life. And, on the other hand, a great degree of habitual wickedness may lay a man under an inability to love and choose holiness, and render him utterly unable to love an infinitely holy being, or to choose and cleave to him as his chief good. So, let me break that down a bit. That's obviously a lot of information, and I probably edited some out in the end, as you might have been able to tell. But either way, I'll break it down a bit. See, what he talked about there were two different things. He talked about natural ability and moral ability. What in the world does he mean by that? Think of it this way. Well, let's. This is a bit of a brutal example, but I'll talk about it. Okay. I am, about 6 foot, and I have some muscle on me. I'm not an athlete by any stretch of the imagination, but compare me to a really young boy, 6 years old, something like that. When we're talking about natural ability, I could, in a hand-to-hand combat, probably take him down pretty easy. And ultimately, I could kill him. Okay, I've got those physical abilities in me, but there's another kind of ability too. If you were to ask me straight up, could you kill that boy? I would have to say no, I couldn't. If you ask any average parent if they have the moral ability to truly harm or even kill their child, they would say no, I couldn't do that. But then you could point and say, but you have 2 arms, and you've got muscle, and you could do it, couldn't you? And they're like, well, and then there's that pause, because there is that distinction. There's natural ability, just saying, well, I've got the capabilities, I've got all the parts I need to do this. I have my mind and my brain and my parts and all these things that could bring it about. But there's this other kind of ability and inability that comes into play in making a decision like that. And this is what Jonathan Edwards is talking about, is that as sinners, as fallen sinners, when we look at God and we see his plans and we see his nature and our sinful flesh reacts to it, what comes about apart from God's miraculous work in our hearts is a moral inability to submit to God. And even though it's a real inability, there's still real responsibility for the fact that we can't do it. And so I drew a little picture here. We can talk about it. Here's a man, and there's his heart, okay? Natural inability is when the heart desires to do something, okay? But there's, circumstances or restraints on him that might keep him from doing it. That would be a natural inability, okay? He cannot do a certain thing if he wills, okay? And if we were commanded to love God and those kind of restraints were on us, we wouldn't be responsible for the fact that we can't do it. But when a desire is not in the heart to love God, there's no inclination moving outward from the person to do that thing, then he can't do it, but not in the same way. He's morally incapable of loving God. And that kind of inability we're responsible for. And only God is the one who can actually get us out of that funk, who can get us out of that sinful condition by his grace. And we're going to get into that a bit more in the next few episodes. So we'll talk about the gospel, we'll talk about the cross, and then we'll talk about the way that the call of God works on a sinner. And so I hope you'll keep watching, and thank you for joining us in this episode. And see you next time. Bye.